right, so we have arrived at our final regular event ahead of our closing session later on this afternoon. And before we get started with that, I just want to remind everybody that in addition to our excellent, wonderful, attentive attendees, this conference is also brought to you by our sponsors: Holistic Think Tank, Cortico, Antioch University, Education Evolving with Teacher-Powered Schools, and Unruler, which we've heard events from now from all of them. They've been incredible. You can find links to their resources, programs, the events that they did in the conference Discord, and linked below this video on YouTube. And it's my deep pleasure now to introduce Keenan Crow, the Director of Policy at One Iowa Action. Is that correct, Keenan?
Yeah, that's close enough.
Okay. I forget the distinction sometimes between One Iowa and then One Iowa
It's
Action.
both One Iowa and One Iowa Action, but we'll
okay, I got you. I know there's PAC and there's other things.
Also that, yeah.
Yes. Okay. So, yep, wearing all the hats all the time. That absolutely is Keenan. And there's somebody that I go to during the legislative session to be like, again, Iowa WTF, like what is going on? Keenan's the first on my message thing, and it's always I've called Keenan a happy warrior in the past, but here we are to learn about how to move from allies to accomplices, and continuing what Iowa WTF laid down for us earlier today, and how we can create supportive spaces for LGBTQ students. So thanks, Keenan, for joining us today.
Absolutely, and thanks for having me. I really appreciate it. Known Nick for well over a decade now, I think. So it's cool to be doing these kinds of events together and not just like hanging out at the university and whatnot. Thank you all for having me. As Nick said, I am the policy director at One Iowa, which is a statewide LGBTQ advocacy organization. And in addition to that work, I also do lots of trainings exactly like these. In fact, I did another one for educators just last week. Representative Ruth Ann Gaines puts on one for folks at the local area education agency, and I always try to get in on that a couple times a year. It's a good time. So I'm going to do a couple different things with this presentation, and only because I do not know what everybody's comfort level is with LGBTQ terminology. I am going to go through some terminology with folks, but I'm going to go through it blazing fast because I want to get to the meat and potatoes, which is like maybe some stuff that you haven't heard before. But if you haven't heard this stuff before and you do have questions about the terminology, please throw them in the chat. And if my moderator friends can help me flag any questions that go in there, that would be awesome, because I'm going to try to get through this terminology stuff as fast as I can so we can also get to some of the good questions. So let's start with the acronym itself, because I find that just this is the source of quite a bit of confusion, especially when we got analyzing things through a policy lens, because especially when we're talking about policy, things are kind of typically be divided into policies that impact sexual orientation and policies that impact gender identity. And the confusing thing about that is the acronym contains both of those concepts, right? So often people think that it's just kind of one thing because it's in the same acronym, but that's simply not the case. So lesbian, gay, and bisexual are all different types of sexual orientations. Gender identity is different than sexual orientation, but kind of related to it in that if you're trying to calculate your sexual orientation, you do first have to kind of figure out what your gender is, but they're not the same, right? So not every gay person is trans, not every trans person is gay. You could be gay and transgender, you could be gay and not transgender, which is what we would call cisgender. Ditto, you could be trans and straight, you could be trans and gay, you could be trans and lesbian. You could have any sexual orientation relative to your gender identity. So that is kind of important. It's, like I said, once we get into the policy space, if we have a policy, for instance, that impacts sexual orientation but not gender identity, then we're kind of missing part of the community. We're missing all of the trans people, right? And there can be good reasons for that. There are things that, for instance, might impact someone with a different sexual orientation in a different way than they would impact somebody with a different gender identity. And maybe we're writing that on purpose. But maybe we're also using it to leave out part of the community that should be protected. So just a quick Iowa example for you. In Iowa, it is a hate crime to assault a Black person for being Black, a Jewish person for being Jewish, a gay person for being gay, because we have sexual orientation protections, but not a transgender person for being transgender, because gender identity is not listed as a category in our hate crimes law. So just one example of how kind of understanding that this is a distinction will end up with better policy, unless your intent is to make worse policy on purpose. Adding to this confusion is the Q. that you will see pop up. And the reason that this is extra confusing is because it could mean either a sexual orientation that isn't straight or a gender identity that isn't cisgender, or both, right? It could be any of those things or all of them at once. I will say there's a generational split around the term queer, which is typically what this means. If you see two in a row, it's going to mean questioning and queer. But if you just see one, it typically just means queer, right? And so for those of us who are kind of my age and younger or just above, so I would say people in their 40s or below, a lot of folks have adopted and kind of reclaimed that term and view it as a term of empowerment. One reason is that it simply covers a lot of different sexual orientations and gender identities without having to kind of name and piecemeal all of that out. The other is that it doesn't necessarily give as much information about you, right? Like if you tell somebody that you're a lesbian, they know that you identify as a woman, you are interested in having relationships with other women. There's a lot of info kind of given out all at once, whereas queer is just a little bit more approachable. There's a little bit more wiggle room. You don't have to give so much information about yourself to still identify that you're part of a particular community, right? However, so for those who are maybe in their 50s, 60s, and 70s, a lot of folks have only encountered that term when it's been associated with violence, harassment, all those other things. And so a kind of important distinction is to not use that word to refer to someone unless they've used that word to refer to themselves first, right? People get to define how we talk about them. And so no one can tell me that I can't use that word to talk about myself, but certainly they can tell me not to use that word when I'm talking about them because it's hurtful or because it brings up all sorts of things that they don't want to deal with in that particular moment. So as long as you can understand that these are two different things, but sometimes certain terms and concepts, roll them together, you'll be in good shape for the rest of the presentation. So let me unpack a couple of those terms since they are fairly important. When I'm talking about sexual orientation, I'm talking about the enduring pattern of romantic and or sexual attraction. They could be different toward other people. It's a pattern. It's not like a one-off thing, right? Just because somebody behaves in a certain way in a certain situation doesn't necessarily mean they're oriented in that way. What we're talking about is a long-term pattern of attraction to a certain other group of people. Now, the most typical sexual orientation folks have is straight, right? That is still a sexual orientation. I think some people think that only LGBTQ people have sexual orientations and gender identities. No, everybody has a sexual orientation and a gender identity. Everybody on this call, everybody we meet, everybody period, right? But sexual orientation protections are typically used for non-straight, non-cis, or non-straight, and then gender identity protections for non-cisgender people, because those are the groups that are typically discriminated against in that way, not because other people don't have them. So straight typically means folks who are attracted to same or opposite sex partners. Again, these are typical definitions. Usages may be different. Lesbian typically means women who are attracted to other women. Gay most often means men who are attracted to other men, although it is much less gendered than the term lesbian, right? Women will use this term as well to describe same-sex or same-gender attraction, again, depending on kind of what your views of sex and gender are in the first place. So Ellen DeGeneres kind of famously calls herself a gay woman rather than calling herself a lesbian. And that is a completely common usage of that term, even though it's maybe not the most typical usage of the term. Bisexual is really dependent on how people view gender and sex in their society in the first place. Some people are going to define it as attraction to both men and women. Some people are going to define it as attraction to their own gender and to other genders. Some people are going to define it as attraction to two or more genders. Again, just very dependent on that person's view of gender as a whole. Pansexual, very similar to bisexual. Some people would actually say that they're the same, and some people will use them interchangeably. Some folks will say they're different. From that camp, typically what you'll hear is that for pansexual folks, gender is a non-factor in attraction. In other words, they are attracted to other things aside from that person's gender expression or gender identity. Typical refrain you're going to hear there is hearts, not parts, right? That the anatomy of somebody doesn't really matter to that person when they're choosing partners for a relationship. And then asexual folks, which sometimes get left out of the conversation, but are just as expected as a part of human sexuality as all of these other sexual orientations. And those are folks who have little or no interest in sexual relationships. They may still have an interest in romantic relationships. You know, there's all sorts of permutations to this, but the important thing to note is that there's nothing wrong with them, right? That asexuality is not a disorder. It's not like a paraphilia or anything like that. None of these, in fact, on this page are paraphilias, disorders. You're not going to find them in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Illnesses because they're not mental illnesses. They're just an expected outcome of human sexuality, right? And just like you wouldn't say that it was weird or wrong to get a straight flush in poker, neither would you say that it's weird or wrong in this case. Yeah, it's rare. Yeah, it's maybe a little bit more uncommon, but that doesn't mean that it's unusual or bad in any way. It's just a little bit less frequent. Sex and gender, you're going to find these defined very differently in policy, but this is the terminology that I'm going to use just to get through some of the concepts that we're talking about today. So when I say the word sex, I'm typically referring to hormones, chromosomes, genital and reproductive anatomy. I'm talking about a biological classification based on reproductive capacity, right? So which organism can reproduce with which other organism. And we apply that across the board to anything that sexually reproduces, whether it be sea otters or elephants or, whatever. If it sexually reproduces, we assign it a sex based on which other organism it can reproduce with, or organisms, in the case of multiple sexed organisms. Gender, on the other hand, is something we only apply to human beings. And that is because it is a set of social, physical, psychological, and emotional traits often influenced in the society where someone resides that classify someone as feminine, masculine, androgynous, or something else entirely. Different societies are going to have different views of what their gender categories are and how they're assigned and what their functions are and all that stuff. There is sometimes an assumption that these two things are going to be the same, right? If you assume that, this presentation will not make any sense whatsoever. If you're willing to die on this hill, then you might as well just log off, because none of it's going to be any sort of use for you in the future. Rest assured, we have good reasons to not just believe, but to know that these two things are different in their presentations. But to each their own. I'm not going to change your mind if you insist that they're the same. Gender identity, therefore, is the persistent internal sense of being a man or a woman or somewhere else along the gender spectrum. As I said before, we all have a gender identity, right? And for most folks, that is correlated with the sex that they are assigned at birth. If your gender identity is a pretty good match for the sex that you were assigned at birth, that means you are a cisgender person. If we've got any chemistry buffs on the channel, you will know that cis and trans are Latin roots, most often used in chemistry notation, that can roughly translate to being on the same side of or being on the opposite side of. So cis, the same side of the sex you were assigned at birth, and trans, the opposite side or a different side of the sex you were assigned at birth. Kind of how those translations work. We didn't just make them up. They were pre-existing terms. Every word is ultimately made up, but that's a totally different presentation. And our gender identity may or may not match others' perceptions of us, particularly for those folks who assert that gender and sex are the same thing. It's going to be hard to convince them otherwise again, right? Gender identity is not something that we can see. It is not visible. You can't pop it out and be like, hey, look at this. Ain't it neat? It's my gender identity. No, that's not how things work. The only way you can know is if somebody actually has a conversation with you about that. But what you can see are gender expressions. And these are kind of the mannerisms, personal traits, ways of dressing. How long is our hair? And in what style is it cut? Are we wearing open-toed or closed-toed shoes? Do they have a significant heel on the back of them? Are we wearing makeup? Are we wearing cologne or perfume? Because scents are gendered in certain ways. Are we sitting with our legs crossed? If so, are they crossed in a traditionally feminine way or a traditionally masculine way? All of these are just kind of little things that serve to communicate our identities as they relate to gender and gender roles. Now, most of them, vast majority of them, have absolutely nothing to do with biological sex, right? There's no gene in your body that says that boys wear blue, girls wear pink. Just doesn't exist. These are societal decisions that we've made and that kind of continue to be perpetuated over and over. And two people with the same gender identity may have different expressions of that identity. If I just took two random women up and just put them on the stream for you right now, they probably would not look the same as one another, right? Well, one might have longer hair, one might be wearing a dress, and the other one might be wearing jeans, one might be wearing makeup, and the other one might not be. And we wouldn't say that one is like more or less of a woman based on how they're dressed or how they style their hair or anything like that. And so even though gender can be a marker of maybe what somebody is trying to tell us, about their gender. That expression in and of itself is not necessarily indicative of any particular identity, especially if we are absent from the cultural context of that identity, because this stuff is super culturally sensitive, right? It varies not just with geographic location and time period, although those are the two biggest modulators, but also our religious beliefs, our political affiliations, our professional expectations. All of these things put parameters around how we feel comfortable expressing our gender to other people. And they're often different between different cultures, right? Like some cultures may have a certain color that signifies one thing, and that same color might signify the totally opposite thing in a different culture. So if we don't actually understand the culture somebody comes from, we're not going to understand what the expressions mean anyway. We're still ultimately going to have a conversation with that person before we make any sort of assumptions. Transgender as a term is itself an umbrella term, right? It encompasses not just binary trans folks, which are, I think, what most people think of when they think of a transgender person. They're thinking either of a trans woman, who is someone who was assigned male at birth, but is now a woman, or a trans man, who is someone who is assigned female at birth, but is now a man. Now, the terms, that's something that I see messed up maybe more than anything else in this conversation, are trans woman and trans man. They're always in the direction of transition, right? We're always trying to validate that person. So someone who is currently a man is a trans man. Someone who is currently a woman is a trans woman. Forget what the assignment at birth is completely and go with the current identity, and you'll get the term right. That's really all there is to it. There is, however, a whole different sub-umbrella, which is the non-binary umbrella. And these are folks who do not necessarily hold the identity of man or woman. They exist either kind of in between that space or outside of that space altogether. Again, this is going to be very hard to understand if you've only examined how gender works in the US in the 1990s and 2000s. This is all going to be very foreign because we pretty much are all in on the binary, right? There are men and there are women, and those gender categories are assigned based on the sex assigned at birth. Not so in multiple different cultures across the world and throughout time periods, right? So very famously, two-spirit folks. These are non-binary folks or folks with different sexual orientations who are part of Native American traditions. Only Native Americans can be two-spirit. It is itself an umbrella term. It's umbrellas all the way down, folks, I assure you. It's itself an umbrella term for a number of different gender identities and sexual orientations, and just identities, period, that don't fit neatly into those two categories, and which existed even on this continent for thousands of years, right? These are not new things. Being non-binary is not something that somebody just came across like 2 weeks ago or 20 years ago or anything like that. That's not how it works. They have always existed. People like this have always existed. We have new terminology now, and people are more aware of it, and therefore more people are coming forward and saying, yeah, actually that makes sense to me. I'm one of those people, right? I'm a non-binary person and thought that I wasn't for 20 some years of my life because I just assumed that everybody else was playing the same kind of game to go along to get along that I was. And I think a lot more people are, rather than continuing to just go along to get along, actually asking themselves, well, what do I actually feel inside, right? Do I feel like a man? What does that actually mean to me? And how does that change how I interact, not only with the rest of the world, but with myself and what I grant myself permission to do? All of these things are very intertwined, again, with the culture. And so the term transgender basically encompasses anybody who crosses over or challenges society standards or expectations surrounding their gender identity, gender roles, etc. So it's much more broad than just transgender men and transgender women. It's all of those other folks who are not necessarily fitting into the mold that society has designated for them. Intersex folks are a little bit different, and I often see this kind of get intertwined in trans folks as well. So an intersex person is a person whose biological sex characteristics are not what we would typically expect from a typical male or typical female body, right? So some variation in genitalia, chromosomes, endocrine systems with your hormones, internal reproductive organs, etc. And that leads me to my next point, which is that even biological sex is not a hard binary, right? I said it was based on reproductive capacity, and I kind of lied, because if we do that, we actually leave out a huge portion of the population. There's lots of people that actually can't reproduce at all, right? They're sterile. And in fact, a lot of intersex people are sterile as well, or they have one set of gametes or the other. There is no such thing as a true human hermaphrodite, which is the term that we used to use for this group of people. We don't anymore, because again, that's a reproductive process that human beings can't engage in, and because it became a slur. So after you use something negatively long enough, it just turns into a slur, it turns out. So these folks would like to be called intersex, and that term should probably be retired for them and reserved only for organisms that can reproduce in that particular fashion. I do find, though, that even if folks can get to the point where they understand that gender is not a hard binary, they will insist that sex is, right? They will insist that it's, you know, you either produce this set of gametes or that set of gametes. But I think that undervalues the entire spectrum of what we associate with sex. Even if we were to cluster all the traits that we think of when we think of sex together, what we would get is this bimodal distribution at the bottom, right? Which is not a hard binary. But you kind of have a cluster of folks with what we would consider typical male bodies, and a cluster of folks with what we consider typical female bodies. And then roughly like 1 to 5% of the population, depending on how you count these characteristics, will come out with an intersex condition. So if you cluster it, you get this bimodal distribution. But if you decluster it, you quickly get into a completely ungraphable situation, right? So this is from a Scientific American article called Beyond XX and XY. It's a great article if you want to check it out. And you'll see that it breaks out all the factors that determine sex. So chromosomes, genes, hormones, internal, external sex organs, secondary sex characteristics like breasts, facial hair, all that kind of stuff. And on the far left, you've got a typical biological female profile. On the far right, you've got a typical biological male profile. And then all the pathways in between are just different available intersex pathways that can happen during development. I'm not going to go through all of this with you folks. If you're interested in diving in, definitely check out that article. But the long and short is, gender is very complicated, and actually so is sex. It's far more complicated than we give it credit for. Again, if we boil it down to reproductive capacity, fine, but that leaves out a whole swath of people and a whole bunch of things that we typically think of when we think of biological sex that aren't reproductive capacity at all. So, okay, finishing up the bit on terminology, this is a genderbread person, and this is just a funny way that many of you have probably seen before that we use to tie up all of these different concepts. There's multiple different ways that you can tease this out. This, I think, is an easy way to visualize it, that you have gender identity, gender expression, anatomical sex, which is different than the sex assigned at birth, right? Because intersex folks often are assigned a binary sex at birth, regardless of their intersex characteristics. And that legal distinction follows you around for the rest of your life in a number of meaningful ways. And so, yes, it absolutely is an assignment. And yes, it's different than your actual anatomical sex characteristics. Those things are separate. And then there's a difference between sexual and romantic attraction, which we talked about briefly before. But just recognize that kind of everybody that we meet is maybe on a slightly different position on all of these scales than we might imagine. Most people are not on the hard binaries of all of this stuff. Most people, if you ask them, you know, do you feel 100% feminine or 100% masculine, are probably going to tell you no, that they feel like maybe even 90% masculine and 10% feminine, but there's some sort of variation in there, right? Most human beings are not on the extremes of these profiles. They're somewhere in the middle, with the exception of sex assigned at birth, because that's often a hard binary assignment. So yeah, this is maybe the simplest way I can boil it down. It's impossible to boil down all the complexity of what we're talking about into a single slide, but this is probably the best I can do. So think about where you would fit on this graph, and then recognize that everybody you interact with, you know, other staff, other teachers, students, administrators, everybody is probably somewhere slightly different on there, whether they want to admit it or not. Everybody is conceiving of this in a slightly different way. So let's talk about what LGBTQ youth tell us that they're concerned about, and we can start kind of unpacking some strategies to address some of those concerns and to mitigate some of the harm that is being done to them, both legislatively and on a societal level. So when we survey both LGBTQ and non-LGBTQ students, the survey results come out quite differently. For non-LGBTQ students, it's stuff that most of us would probably expect, especially if we're not from an LGBTQ background, right? It's things about their classes or exams or grades is the primary concern. And then next is what they're going to do for a college or a career after high school. And then next after that is financial pressures related to whether or not they're going to college or starting a career afterward. On the other hand, LGBTQ kids, the number one concern they have is their family's not accepting them. Number two is being bullied. Number three is fear of being outed or being open in the wrong spot. And if we look down on the survey, you don't get to trouble with classes until 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, like sixth down. So there's where you finally start to get what the non-LGBTQ kids are thinking about. Everything up to that point is kind of either a concern that's unique to being LGBTQ or a concern that is disproportionately impacting those LGBTQ youth. So what can we actually do about these things? Well, there's a few policies that have been demonstrated to work really well, actually, some of which are precluded by legislation in certain states and some of which are not. So this is kind of a bevy of different options that you can adopt based on what you are able to do in the moment. Number one is policies that treat similarly situated students the same. And so when I'm thinking of differential treatment of students, things that come to mind immediately are like public display of affection policies, right? I remember when I was in school, if a boy and a girl were to kiss in the hallway, it was like, oh, come on, don't do that. If a boy and a boy were to kiss in the hallway, that was like a giant earth-shattering deal that required the attention of the administration and parents and meetings and all sorts of other things. And so that's, not treating similarly situated students the same, right? Anytime that you're treating LGBTQ students in a differential way, you're wanting to look at, okay, is that because I'm uncomfortable about this, or is there actually a need that's being addressed in that differential treatment? In this case, obviously, that example, there's no actual need. It's more of just a bias that is trying to be accommodated because other people are uncomfortable with it. Policies that don't police gender via dress codes, restroom access, names, or pronoun preferences. Now, this one is somewhat precluded by recent Iowa laws, and I'll go through that here in a little while. But gender does not need to play a role in your dress codes, right? Anybody can wear anything. And so if you're going to say no spaghetti straps, fine, but say no spaghetti straps. Don't say no spaghetti straps for girls, right? Like that's often the implication that you'll hit there. Any policy that you can design for a dress code can be adapted into a gender neutral policy, period, the end. I think dress codes are stupid in and of themselves, but if you must have one, at least design it in a gender neutral way. It's super easy to do. Restroom access, ditto. You don't need to police people's restroom access. They know which restroom they're supposed to be using. Names, trust and believe that people are going to tell you the name that they want to be addressed by, whether it's different from their legal name, doesn't matter. Ditto with their pronoun preferences. All of that stuff should be respected. It's just a matter of basic respect, right? If you want to be called Mr. Covington and not Nick, then certainly you can call your students what they would like to be called as well. Again, just as a matter of mutual respect. Policies that don't allow bullying of LGBTQ folks or gender nonconforming students by peers or staff. And again, I think that's pretty straightforward. There's not a lot of nuance there. If you're picking on a kid because they are a boy and they're wearing a dress, that's not okay. Anybody can wear any article of clothing and you don't need to comment about it. And you don't need to let anybody else comment about it either. And when we're talking about disciplinary interventions, the best ones we know are very consistent, right? Like making sure that anytime that issue is coming up, that you're treating it in the exact same way. If somebody's making a negative comment, that you immediately say, hey, that's not acceptable, in this space, and that you're always, always, always following up on that and not letting comments slide, because the second you let one comment slide, there's going to be a torrent of them following it up. Policies that do not automatically notify the parents of victimized LGBTQ youth against their will, or notify them, period, of their LGBTQ status, because that can present some serious safety and security challenges at home for some of these kids, right? If you kind of total up the population of LGBTQ youth nationwide, you get roughly 10 to 20% of our US youth population identifying as LGBTQ, depending on how you count it. But if you look at our homeless youth population, that's about 40% are LGBTQ identified. So it can be incredibly risky to out these kids. They may lose their homes, they may lose, access to their social media or the ability to go out with their friends. There's all sorts of things that people can hang over their heads that will ultimately make their mental health and their learning outcomes much, much worse. And so notifying parents without talking to that kid and without like involving them in that process is a horrible idea. Again, we have an Iowa law that has now gone into effect that requires folks to notify if a kid asks to be called by a different name or use different pronouns, things like that. It's a horrible policy. It's going to create a whole lot of danger where no danger needs be had. Also be aware of how you're splitting up your class. Don't split up classes by gender for projects, teams, partners, reading aloud, any of that stuff. You're going to put either a non-binary kid in a really awkward situation where they don't know where to go, or you're going to force a closeted trans kid to endure some gender dysphoria that they don't necessarily have to endure, right? Somebody who has not come out as maybe being a girl, but is now forced to read in the boys group and be associated with boys in a very explicit way. Again, just not necessary. Do things like, birth date, favorite color, all of those things are good ways to split up the class without having to gender it. Don't make assumptions about gender or sexual orientation. That goes ditto for your colleagues as it does for those students. And just, general interactions, period. A couple executive directors ago, we had an executive director that absolutely hated to fly. And the reason that he hated to fly was every time, without fail, every time he got on a plane, somebody would see his wedding ring and would say, "Where is your wife?" Like literally the same script every single time he flew. He didn't have a wife, he had a husband. And so that initially put that conversation in a weird place. And then, from that point on was not super comfortable for anybody. So just watch those assumptions, right? And try to use gender neutral language, which I will talk about here in another slide, to the best of your ability so that you avoid communicating those assumptions, even if you have made them internally. Make sure that staff and peer advisors receive training specific to these issues. Make sure they understand the terminology that you're talking about in the first place. Make sure they understand the differential risks. The terminology took me maybe 20 minutes to get through. It wasn't super long. I know you can probably get through that with somebody else in a relatively short period of time. So a couple strategies to become more LGBTQ inclusive, kind of on an interpersonal level. Obviously, mirroring language is number one, and that is business sales 101 too. What's the quickest way to build rapport with somebody? It's to listen to how they're talking about themselves and to repeat it exactly back to them so that you demonstrate that you were hearing what they had to say. Obviously, like I said, avoid making assumptions. Ask and give your pronouns, not just your students, but you as well, so that you demonstrate that behavior. Use and practice gender neutral language, and of course, prepare to apologize. And I've got a whole slide on apologizing. So let's talk about gender neutral terminology first. I'm in the Midwest. In the Midwest, we say, "Hey, you guys." And, that's fine for some folks. I don't mind it personally, but some people do. And some people who are not even trans, right? I lived in the South for a while too. Call a Southern woman, "Hey, you guys." Call, even as a group. I dare you. I double dare you to do it, because they will immediately come back to you as, "Do I look like a guy to you?" That's what you're going to hear. So just try to cut that one out. Try to cut out gender terminology, especially when talking to groups, right? Folks is a good one. Everyone. I also lived in West Texas, so I know that y'all is singular and all y'all is plural. You can change those to your needs. Honored guests, distinguished guests, all different ways that you can go without those unnecessarily gendered markers. You can also change the things that traditionally have "man" in them to "person," right? Rather than postman, do postperson. Rather than serviceman, do serviceperson. Congressman, congressperson. You can change out all of your parental language to "parent." You don't have to say maternity leave or paternity leave or anything like that. You don't have to say maternity clothing. You can say parental leave. You can say pregnancy clothing. You can say caregiver. You can say guardian. You can say parent. All of those things which are gender neutral and don't have inbuilt assumptions to them. Sibling and child are, of course, gender neutral ways to talk about younger folks, partner, significant other, spouse, are gender neutral ways to talk about boyfriends, girlfriends, all of those different terms that we typically associate with gender. And then if you're talking about anatomy, just use the correct anatomical language. You don't need to say men's cancer screenings. You can say prostate cancer screenings. You can say uterine cancer screenings. You can say breast cancer screenings, right? You can use those actual terms. And what we find is when we do use those terms, that the people who are impacted are actually more likely to go get those screenings rather than if we gender them in an unnecessary way. So trans people are more likely to get the screenings they need when we actually talk about the anatomical parts that they might have, rather than trying to assign them a gender in one way or another and try to figure out, okay, well, can I get funding for that? This says funding for a women's health program. I'm not a woman, even though I need a uterine cancer screening. I don't know if I can afford it. There's all these barriers to that. Just go with the parts. Super easy. Now, you are going to make a mistake. And I know that because I've been doing this for 10 years and I still make mistakes every single day, right? You're going to make an assumption that you didn't think of. Our language is ultimately just a pattern, right? Like just like music is a pattern, we memorize different musical passages and we kind of regurgitate them without thinking about them. Ditto with how we speak. We memorize these different phrases and interactions and we just kind of regurgitate them without thinking about them. And because some of this is shifting and changing, one of these days you're going to regurgitate a pattern that doesn't actually make sense and you're going to have to apologize, and that's okay, right? Even though you didn't mean it, it doesn't matter. If I come and I pat my friend on the back as a gesture of goodwill, but they've got a sunburn and it hurts, I didn't mean to hurt them, but I did. And so I'm going to apologize because I hurt them on accident, right? So a good apology is sincere and authentic. It affirms the person that we're talking about. It's concise, and then you move on and you don't revisit it later, because ultimately what we're trying to do is affirm this person without drawing a ton of attention to them, which is a tough needle to thread, I will admit, right? But that's the goal that we're trying to achieve. And so our apology should be structured in that way. So some things to avoid are being overly apologetic, right? If you make a big scene, you're drawing attention. And so that's something that we're trying to avoid. Ditto with explaining why you misgendered someone. Again, with the sunburn, it doesn't matter why you hurt that person with the sunburn. You hurt that person. And so we're going to apologize anyway. Giving an explanation typically devalues it. The other thing that sometimes happens when you're explaining is you get into blaming, which is the next thing to avoid. And then at the end of your apology, the person you're apologizing to is apologizing to you. Now, if that happens, that is no longer an apology. If that person is apologizing to you, that is something that is about your feelings and not about apologizing to that person. So don't do that. Don't panic. Don't dwell on the mistake. If you've already apologized for it, move on. Don't bring it up again. Don't bring it up 2 or 3 times. Now, some people will say, well, what if I forgot and I realize I did it, a month later or something? I think it's reasonable to, in a very private way, say, hey, I recognize that I did this and I'm sorry and I won't do it again. But if you've already apologized for it and you're bringing it up a month later, again, that's just drawing extra attention to it. So a good apology is about 2 to 3 sentences at most, and it recognizes, that you did something wrong. Nick, can I misgender you really quickly just to make this point? Great. And you use he and him pronouns typically, Nick? Yeah. So, Nick and I, we were going fishing and she brought the toolbox, the tackle box. And oh man, I screwed up more than just the tackle box. Sorry. I know Nick uses he and him. So he grabbed the tackle box and, I grabbed the poles and we went fishing. That's it. It's just, sorry, here's what Nick uses. I will use that next time. And we move on and we continue our conversation. That's a good apology. Anything more than that, you're starting to drift into some dangerous territory. So keep it as short as you can. All right. So as I said before, we are going to talk a little bit about some of the new laws in Iowa. I'm not going to go into depth on them because I know you talked a little bit with Iowa WTF on some of this stuff, but just so you kind of have an idea of what we're dealing with, and then how that impacts LGBTQ youth in some ways that we can think around some of these policies is really what I want to get to. Where am I at with time here?
I'd say we've
Okay,
got
I got
about
20 minutes.
10, 15 minutes or so.
Okay, 15 minutes. Perfect. I can do that. So we do have a new book ban, which is a ban on any book with any description of a sex act at any grade level, which is bonkers, to say the least. That is lots of classic literature. So it's going to be interesting to see what actually gets pulled from the shelves. We have Don't Say Gay. Yeah, somebody said, is that most books? Yes. We have Don't Say Gay and Don't Say Trans. That's grades K-6. We've got forced outing of transgender students, which I mentioned earlier. If they ask for a different name or pronouns or any sort of restroom accommodations, which they can't have actually, then they will immediately be outed to their parents. We have a school bathroom bill that doesn't allow them to use the appropriate restrooms. And then info on HIV and HPV and the vaccine associated with HPV are no longer required, despite the fact that Iowa has the highest rates of cancers caused by HPV in the country right now. So not really the state that should be pulling those back at the moment. Here's kind of how it impacts LGBTQ youth. What you'll see is that this was sampled in January. This was before the big wave of legislation. So I expect that this has gotten much worse, unfortunately, rather than better. And what you find is that, for instance, about 86% of trans and non-binary youth say that they were impacted in some way negatively, that they've had their mental health impacted by this kind of legislation. And again, this was in January. So our laws had not even started to pass through the system at that point. I really do think that these are going to be much higher numbers next year when they survey again in January. We'll have, more data and be able to tease that out further, but it's hard for me to imagine that these have not gone up, considering how much legislation was passed in these last 6 months or so. So a few strategies of moving from ally to accomplice. Everything that I've talked about thus far, I would consider kind of under the banner of ally, right? We're trying to interpersonally make things better. We're trying to facilitate better communication in one-on-one situations. But when you try to move past that, you start looking at structural interventions, in my opinion. You start looking at how you can use the power that you have, either as an educator or an administrator or a staff member or whatever else, that is greater than and beyond what students could do, right? Students can do most of the things that I just talked to you about. They can use appropriate language with each other. They can not make assumptions. They can do a lot of this stuff, but you can do some unique things. So you can't simply treat everyone the same. I hear people say this quite a bit. And the analogy that I typically use in this space is like an eye doctor, right? If an eye doctor treated everyone the same, that would mean everybody has the same glasses prescription, and it's not really helpful for anybody. It is equal treatment, right? But it's not super helpful treatment. We really need to be analyzing what people need and then giving them that, rather than just giving the same thing to everybody, because that's just not useful for anyone in the long run. And so we have to move past this kind of reasonable accommodation language into necessary accommodations, making sure that we're recognizing that there are just some things, even if they're not necessarily reasonable by administrator standards, that are going to be non-starters for these students to learn, right? And one of those things is actually being accepted in their space. This is something that peers can do, but it's something that adults can do in a kind of a markedly different way. And we know that acceptance is different than actually affirming someone, right? Just tolerating somebody is very different than actually welcoming them into your space. And so trying to figure out how you can create a welcoming space, making sure that you have appropriate imagery around, that all of your imagery and your books are not just about heterosexual couples, nuclear families, all those kinds of things, right? Whatever's in your classroom, whether it's posters or books or flags or whatever else, is sending a message to those students about what matters to you. And so you need to be thinking about how you send that message in a really inclusive way. Also, one of the things that I see kind of a unique role for teachers being able to do is to actively work to dispel myths and misunderstandings about LGBTQ people. I like to do that through humor. Sometimes that's acceptable in the classroom and sometimes that's not. But I've got to retort to dang near everything that people say to me on a regular basis, right? And I'm ready with that to hit it in an appropriate way as best I can. So here's just a couple of examples. Something that I hear quite a bit. Well, so many young people are coming out now, they must be doing it to get get attention, right? This is a social contagion, as I hear so often. That's quickly refuted if you just look at a few other things that were actively suppressed for a period of time. One of those things being left-handedness, right? And I have some unique experience with this in that not only am I a non-binary person, but I am somebody who would have been left-handed were it not for my preschool teacher forcing me to write with my right hand and disciplining me when I didn't. So when you do that, you artificially suppress the number of people who are going to be doing that thing or identifying in that way, right? And so when you lift that artificial suppression, what it's going to look like is artificial inflation. But that's not what's actually happening. You're just removing the suppression, and that's exactly what's happening here. Ditto for when people start trying to talk about binary sex. Right? There's only two elements. It's basic chemistry, because 99% of the universe is either helium or hydrogen. So clearly, if we have to just throw away all of chemistry to accommodate all these other elements, then that is just ridiculous, right? No, again, just because something is less common does not make it less important or less good or less necessary, because most of the things that we need to be alive are in that 1%, right? We need carbon, we need oxygen, we need all sorts of other elements that aren't just helium and hydrogen. And, ditto, I can make an argument that we need trans and non-binary people to exist, because if they don't, just as mandated religion means there's no freedom of religion, well, mandated gender means there's no freedom of gender either. There's no freedom to identify in any way other than what society has prescribed. So when we're looking at bad legislation, and this is something that I think about often, how can folks that are in the system actually resist some of the things that are coming, or how can they do it in less damaging ways? The number one thing, and the thing that I see that makes me the saddest all the time, is people who are just willing to help the folks who are harming children, right? People who are just going to say, well, there's some books that are banned, I'll just get rid of my entire library in my classroom because it's easier, and that way I don't have to go through the heartache of taking them out one by one. Again, that might be easier for you, but it sends a message to your students. And so don't do things that are more harmful than what's legally required. And if there is something that's legally required, make damn sure that it's legally required before you do it, if you know that it's going to hurt somebody, right? Talk to your union rep. Talk to a lawyer if you must. Don't go any further than you absolutely have to, and even then question why you're going that far, right? One of the more insidious things about totalitarian regimes, period, is that a lot of the work that they accomplish, they don't have to do anything in order to accomplish it. They just convince people that it's in their best interest to help them out, and those people do it of their own volition, right? So somebody put in the chat that they don't call their class library or library, it's a personal collection, and that means they get to keep the challenged books. Absolutely, right? This is my third point, and that is help find and leverage loopholes in vague and poorly written laws, because often these laws are written vaguely in order to intimidate people, not to be actionable, right? They don't care if they actually are able to sue anybody. They don't care if the enforcement mechanism works. What it's there to do is to actually chill speech. That's the whole point. And so I imagine that's exactly how Iowa's law is going to be as well, because at least up until this point, the Department of Education hasn't even released guidance on what books are and aren't going to be acceptable. And I would be skeptical to see them release guidance before the beginning of the next school year. I really think that they're just banking on people doing their work for them and taking out any book that they might think is even kind of maybe slightly objectionable. Don't do it. Just don't. Force them to force your hand. If they're gonna make you do something, make them own it, right? Don't own it yourself. There's no reason for you to do that, and it's ultimately just going to make you feel worse in the process. Offer to be on committees that are going to decide how to implement these legal challenges if you care about these kids, right? Think about how you can take this law and make it the least harmful version of this law that you can. Read it really, really closely. Words like and or matter a lot. And if you can find something where you can make a reasonable argument, make that reasonable argument and implement that policy in a less harmful way, right? Also remember that federal laws supersede state laws, and federal laws require equal treatment, especially of gay and trans kids. So there may be an argument that you can make to the administration. Again, this is very dependent on the particular law, but there may be an argument that you can make essentially saying, look, we have to follow all the laws, and this state law is in conflict with the federal law. And so we have to follow the federal law. Like, there's no argument here. You know, there is a supremacy clause. And so federal law takes precedent, period, the end, right? So here's one thing that this can look like. And I just want you to maybe drop in the chat if you have an answer to a few ways that you could get around this. Here is Iowa's bathroom bill. I'm trying to spell out some of the most important bits in it. Think about how you could implement this in a way that is less harmful than what I'm seeing across the state right now. So Iowa's bathroom bill, number 1, requires that students not be allowed to, quote, access a multiple occupancy restroom or changing area, or a single occupancy restroom or changing area designated for use by students of the opposite sex while students of the opposite sex are present or could be present. Number 2, they have defined sex as a person's biological sex as male or female, as listed on a person's official birth certificate issued at or near the time of that person's birth. Number 3, that there is a notable exception to that policy necessary to accommodate disabled persons or young children in need of physical assistance when using a multiple occupancy restroom. And then number 4, that the enforcement mechanism is that a citizen first must file a complaint. The district then has 3 days to cure that complaint. And if they don't cure that complaint, it is then referred to the Attorney General for potential litigation. What can we think of in order to mitigate some of these harms? What could we do? What things could we think of to get around some of these things? Someone said federal definition of sex. Yeah, we could look at what those federal laws are and see how that interacts, right? Emma, you have your hand
up. So I live in a state very similar to Iowa, with very similar laws. And so what my school has done is we have kept on every other floor, because we have 5 floors, the male and female bathrooms. So on the odd floors, or on the even floors, I can't remember, they're gendered bathrooms. And then on the even floors or the odd floors, they are non-gendered bathrooms.
Yeah, that's one way to do it, right?
It was really easy.
Gender neutralize certain facilities, that will work. Now, I will say in this case, it specifically says you can't do a multiple occupancy restroom where students of the opposite sex could be present. So if it's multiple occupancy, that wouldn't work in this situation, right? But it could work if the law in your state says something different, or they've defined sex in a different way. That could also be a solution. Somebody else said, I'm not a cop. I'm not going to check people's genitals on the way to the bathroom. Yeah, you don't have to be the potty police. You're not in charge. I don't care who goes to what bathroom. Someone asked, disabled persons, how is disabled defined in the law? Yes. So you've hit on something very interesting, and something that I have found some people have had success with so far, is that it specifically says accommodate disabled persons or young children in need of physical assistance. That means anybody with a disability theoretically could be granted an exemption to this, right? In some way, shape, or form. And I have seen people get exemptions to this based on having an IEP, saying that changing their restroom after they've been going to the same restroom for the last 10 years is actually a really big disruption in their life, and is likely to worsen certain aspects of their disability. So yeah, that's absolutely one way we can get around it, is looking at that. Someone else said it states student restrooms. So what if the restrooms are staff restrooms and students are permitted exemptions? Yes, that's another way. You can definitely look at that direction. But one thing that people are missing, and one thing that I think administrations across our state should consider, is what happens if no one files a complaint? Nothing. Nothing happens if no one files a complaint. And if someone does file a complaint, you have 3 days to cure. You can change policy at that point, right? So literally, you don't need to do anything until someone complains. And if you are doing something before someone complains, I think that goes back to don't help them, right? Like they don't need the help. You don't have to do anything. And so my advice to districts across the state is don't do anything until you get a complaint. And then you can change your policy so that you don't get sued. You got 3 whole days to do it. Who cares? Like, what's the consequence going to be if you get a complaint and then cure it? Nothing. They can't do anything legally. So don't help them. Right? That's really the name of the game here. Just don't help them at any point. Drag your feet if you must, because dragging your feet is not illegal. I just want to leave you with this, and then I'll open it up for questions. And that's that the data we have is that all you really need to dramatically decrease a kid's risk of suicide is one supportive adult. That's it. One supportive adult means that you have a 40% less likely chance of a suicide attempt. That's huge. That's almost half just by being a supportive adult in their lives. You can be that adult. You can be that person. You can help lower those numbers dramatically just by being supportive to those kids in your classroom. So happy to take questions. You can also message me privately if you don't want your name in the chat. That's totally okay too. I will have my email on this after this as well. If you don't want your question answered in public, that's also okay. I know, especially if you're in a state that's maybe in a rough situation, that you don't want to open up your strategies to everybody else and broadcast what you're doing out there. So that's cool too. My email is private and not a state email, so they can't FOIA me. Someone asked, will I be willing to share my slides? Yes, if you promise not to redistribute them and you promise not to let them get into the hands of a bunch of conservatives that can kind of reverse engineer this to make things worse. Cool.
I think we can trust
I will send them
Julia.
to Nick. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. We can be the distributor. With
Yes.
that said, I have shared some on social media, just screenshots.
Yeah.
Would you prefer I not do that? I guess I tagged you in it. You can see what they are. I can always pull those things down too.
I'll just tell you.
Okay. Yeah.
I mainly just don't want the drag your feet stuff on social media because I don't want folks to get wind of that.
Totally. Okay. Yeah. I'll take a look, but that's a good call. I don't want to make your job and teachers' jobs more difficult, so we can do that.
Fair enough.
And I think just unless anybody has an impending question. Nice, Hannah. Appreciate your time and energy. Yes. I mean, we could go for hours. And in fact, if you want to follow up with this, I think, Keenan, we did a podcast about this time last year when the legislative session was rolling last spring. So there actually is an HRP episode where Keenan and I just talked about this stuff. And it largely was about the same issues, except then they went on to pass all the really bad shit. So
that was only after the athletics ban, which things have kind of gotten worse since then.
Yes.
But yeah.
Yes. So now we've kind of moved less in the prevention space and more into the resistance space. So correct. I think that's really was the focus of this too there. So hopefully everybody can kind of find this useful. Absolutely reach out to Keenan. And I think One Iowa has a kind of a distributed network of chapters as well in some other states. So if you're in a state, you might even be able to find whoever that state's Keenan is to
look up. So if you look up the Equality Federation, that's kind of the loose federation of statewide organizations, and that'll tell you which organization in your state is doing this kind of work.
Yes. Are there national groups beyond like the state chapters that you would recommend people get in touch with too if they want to?
Absolutely. Trevor Project is where I pulled a lot of this data from. They are wonderful. GLSEN is another wonderful organization. Family Equality fills a slightly different niche. So GLSEN and Trevor are mostly about LGBTQ kids, right? Family Equality is more about kids of LGBTQ parents, which is a slightly different thing, but still something that we see discrimination happening toward. And so that's another useful one. PFLAG is another great one. HRC, of course, does a lot of work around this. If you're interested specifically in the athletic stuff, Athlete Ally is definitely the organization that I would recommend every single day of the week. Their team is just incredible. So yeah, there's lots and lots of them out there on the national level as well. You bet. Oh, G-Safe, yes, good one.
Awesome. Well, my goodness. Thank you so much again, Keenan. You're our bookend, our capstone, to a day that started with Iowa WTF and kind of ends with Iowa WTF, in a sense. So thanks. Thanks so much again for your energy, your enthusiasm. As always, you're incredible. Thanks for spending time with us and our crew. And I'm sure we'll talk soon about stuff. So thanks again. And everybody, here real quick before people leave. Chris would kill me if I didn't mention that we do have a closing session that's taking place an hour from now. Is that right, Chris? So we have a nice little break. I would encourage everybody, we'll do an all call for this thing. It's kind of our send off. We'll do some group processing. We'll kind of, it'll be like last day at summer camp kind of vibes. We'll exchange yearbooks. We'll get to sign off on that, and really just send us off into the summer and into the 2023 school year on a good note. So be sure to attend that in an hour. But in the meantime, take a stretch break, take the dogs for a walk, do what you got to do, and we'll see you back here in a little bit.